Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come. It's fantastic. It's 32 years since I was last in Calgary. I hate to admit that when I thought about it yesterday. And I went to the World Sheep and Wool Congress in Edmonton and then ended up in Calgary and going to the Rockies and so on. But I do have family connections to Canada as well. My father spent the war years as a teenager in Nova Scotia. His father worked for Vickers and was building ships. And so he always yearned to get back to Canada to live. And now my 25-year-old son he desperately would like to come to Canada. He spent a year in the States and he really wants to get to Canada. So if anybody knows anybody that's a computational neuroscientist, see me afterwards. Okay, so today then, I'm going to try not to tell you how to do things. I really want to get you guys thinking about how you might do things better. In the UK, we have certain parts of the world from the Antipodes who like to come and tell us how to do it, and we don't take too kindly. So I don't really see why you should have to put up with the UK telling you how to do it. But I hope what I'm trying to try and do, and I've spoken to Robin at some length to try and get some background, I really just want to try and stimulate some discussion. So we're going to have a couple of breakout sessions during the day where in your little groups you're going to talk about some issues and then we're going to try and capture some things as well, okay? And hopefully we're right sound-wise. Rob, are you happy? Yeah, okay. So the other thing that's interesting before I start as well is that I'm looking at the room and you're not like UK sheep farmers at all. A room full of UK sheep farmers, they're all balding a bit and they've all got fairly sticky out ears. Now your ears aren't sticking out too far though, are they? And do you know why that is? Do you know why that is? Because they spend all their life going, how much? My God. Because the prices are never high enough, okay? And obviously in Canada that's not the case. Yeah, right. Okay, so what do I do? What do I do? Just a very quick, I suppose it's nearly 40 years now I've been a sheep consultant, which is quite scary really. But on a day-to-day basis, my day job is that I probably spend about half of my time actually as a consultant to sheep producers. So I have sheep producers, individual clients, and where they're smaller producers, we would work in groups because obviously there's a cost element to that. So I am working either one-to-one or with small groups with sheep producers. So I have to take the problems, try and come up with the solutions, and the bottom line is we're trying to make money out of sheep. So I hope that kind of qualifies me a little bit in terms of the issues that we face. The other half of my life these days, I spend quite a lot of time talking about, and I'll mention it as we go through today, but it will only be a mention. We have massive problems in the UK with resistance to wormers, anthelmintic resistance. And so 14 years ago, I kicked off the Sustainable Control of Parasites in Sheep group, and that takes up quite a lot of my time now. And I was on my feet at a conference last week talking about sheep. You haven't got sheep scab, have you? You don't want it either. We now have resistant sheep scab mites. And I was saying to the audience, I was kind of hoping that they might hold off till I'd retired, but the little devils have caught me out. So now we've got that as well. And there's a few copies of that down here if anybody wants those. And the other thing that I'll do is I'll get involved in, and I only have one copy, and Elaine's already bagged this one, but we'll give you the website. A couple of colleagues of mine and I rewrote what was the 1988 UK Bible, if you like, on feeding the ewe. So this is it was only been published in the last 12 months. So you can get, I'm sure we can get there's lots of really good resources on that website as well, if you wanted that. So doing things like that, and just generally being involved in the UK sheep industry. So I can talk to many of you again at lunchtime if you want to know a little bit more about that. So I thought maybe what we would start with, and just sort of ease ourselves in quite gently, would be to just do a bit of background on the UK sheep industry, but in the context of the challenges that we're facing, to maybe just start teeing up you guys thinking about what your main challenges are in the Canadian industry. They're going to be different. Some of them are going to be very similar. In a 10-minute conversation with Darlene last night, it became obvious that quite a few of them are similar, I think. Okay, so in terms of our ewe flock population, we're running at just over 16 million ewes at the moment. Okay, it's a big industry from that point of view. Your industry is probably about the same size as Northern Ireland would be for us, so I can get my head around that. But the one thing to notice from this slide particularly is how that varies over the years. So back in 1946 we were down at just over 8 million, and that's basically because we ploughed the grass up and we ate them during the war. We hadn't got much choice. And after that, numbers have built back up again. I'm going to do this because I know Rob doesn't want me to turn to the screen too much, so I'm going to do that so I can see it there. Okay. And then it built back up again. And then there's this great big lump of ewes in 1990. And the reason why I want to sort of draw your attention to that is that the reason why we had such a massive increase to up to over 20 million ewes in the early 1990s was simply that the way the subsidy scheme was being constructed. So at that stage, our farmers were getting, and I'm trying to do the equivalents here, but the equivalent of about 30 Canadian dollars per ewe per year, simply to have the ewe on the farm. That's a big incentive to have sheep, okay? So the relativity, and if you look at the history of the UK industry, and I will come back to this, one of our biggest challenges now, and the Brexit word I'm sure will come up several times because it's the scourge of our lives at the moment, one of our biggest challenges is we've got to wean ourselves off it. We have got to. It's been a massive break on us moving forward in terms of efficiency. So where you see these things in our ewe population, a lot of it is subsidy driven. So if you look at a picture of, this is Hampshire in England, and you look at there's grass there and a few trees, and then around it there's lots and lots of arable. The sheep industry in the UK is subject to so many outside pressures. So the fortunes of our arable industry dictates what happens with the UK sheep industry. And a few years ago, George W. over the border there was pushing biofuels a lot, and a huge amount of the Midwest of the US went down to biofuel production, maize for biofuels. Well, the knock-on effect of that on the worldwide cereal market was huge. And it ricocheted onto our UK sheep industry because it suddenly meant that our mixed farms, it was much more profitable to grow cereals and maize and so on than it was to have sheep. So the sheep get booted off the good land again and we end up on the poor land. So we tend to, have to bend in the wind to whatever's going on, both worldwide and in Europe, but also subsidy is a major issue for us. So in terms of where are the sheep in the UK, let's bust the myth. England has the biggest population. The Scots like to think, everyone thinks Scotland and Wales for sheep. England has the most sheep, which as an English person I'm quite proud to say. And Elaine, you'll back me up on that. The Scottish flock's been contracting faster. But I did read in something that Robin sent me that the UK flock is contracting. No, it's going back up again. We reached a low point of about 14 million ewes. In the wake of 4 million sheep being killed with foot and mouth in 2001. And we've built back up from that very low ebb, back up to about 16 million, which is roughly where the industry sits if she's not under too much pressure from other things. And in terms of flock size, again, I'm not going to make any bones about the fact that obviously on a day-to-day basis I'm dealing with flocks of 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, one last week that's one of my clients. So, and that's simply because they're the people who can afford to pay for a private consultant to do the work. But equally I spend quite a lot of time in Wales working with much smaller flocks with people with 200 and 300 and 400 flocks. So occasionally you might just need to bring me back to earth and say, but hang on a minute, it's all right, you with your big flocks, okay? I'm quite happy for you to bring me back to book on that. But you can see there that about 16% of our ewes are in flocks of over 1,000 ewes. But equally, we've got a lot of smaller ones. So equally, we have got a lot of people who, I think calling it hobbies may be a bit rude. I don't mean it in that context. But people who keep sheep and have got lots of other things that they do, and sheep aren't of their main part of their living. In terms of production, well, we produce about 300,000 tonnes of sheep meat a year, and we consume about 300,000 tonnes, which is really kind of convenient. But we import between 90 and 100,000 tonnes a year, mainly from New Zealand, of course, a historical thing. And we export about 100,000 tonnes a year. When I say that to the students that I lecture to, you can see them going, what the hell is that all about? Well, of course, how's that? It's down to seasonality, isn't it? And the UK industry is extremely seasonal. And I know from what I've picked up talking to Robin, and I've been reading a bit of background before I came out here, that you guys have got accelerated lambing systems and all sorts of things. And I'd be interested to talk to somebody at lunchtime, because when I did my degree, it was reproductive physiology was my bag, so I'm really into that sort of thing. But seasonality is what does us for that. So if you look at our production, and this graph just gives you a little bit of an idea, then at the moment we're in Q1, so we're basically slaughtering lambs that are tail end has been kept on since last spring when they were born. Then we get to a low point in about March, April, when our lambs are coming down. That's when the Kiwis, because they mirror image us in terms of our seasons, historically that's when the New Zealand lamb comes in. And it's quite important to us. So you will hear some UK producers giving the Kiwis a hard time and so on, but actually that's a balance that we need to be able to keep our consumers eating good quality lamb all the year round. So in the UK, we would eat probably about 2.25 kilos per head per year, and I think you're just under a kilo. So our guys are eating more than double. So I was just saying to somebody earlier on, that gives you quite a bit of scope, I think, doesn't it, to increase the amount of production. So seasonality is our issue, and that's why we actually do it. So the other real main challenges that we have, obviously Brexit's a real challenge to us, but mainly, hopefully, we're not going to hit tariffs. We don't know that, and I be honest, I think probably we'll get to the 30th of March next year, and the 31st will be the next day, and we'll probably find out the next day, the way our politicians are going. But exchange rates are what so important to us. So at the moment, our farmers, I'll show you some prices in a minute, but our farmers have had quite a good couple of years since the announcement and the vote for us to come out of Europe, mainly because the pound has gone down the pan, and against the euro is quite strong relative to the pound, and that means we can export a lot more easily. So exchange rate is very, very important to us. And so that drives prices. And the other thing to just note, and a lot of our producers don't realise this, is that 300,000 tonnes a year is very finely balanced. 2,000 tonnes either way, either overproduce against a strong pound or underproduce, will make a massive difference to our price. Just 2,000 tonnes. It's very, very sensitive. Okay, so there's our prices. And what I've also done on there, just again from the information that I've got, just put a little arrow on there just to sort of give me a feel as well for roughly where the sort of prices that I was thinking I was supplied with you were getting. You might argue with that. I'm sure it's not that all the year round. But just to give you a feel for the fact that you're probably overall a little bit higher than us, but we will go higher at certain times. And again, the seasonality of that is quite pronounced. The red line was 2017, but what is happening is that the big increase in price that we used to see, again, supply and demand, so as the supply was coming back and the demand was going up around about that end of first quarter, beginning of the second quarter, we would see prices rise. But if you actually look at the months along the bottom of there now, that's shifting later and later. So our producers who are lambing early and incurring quite a lot of cost are finding that it just isn't sustainable anymore. And so we're seeing a shift in production. And that's the Kiwi effect, basically. Our big retailers, I think it's about 60% of lamb in the UK now goes through the big major retailers rather than butchers or direct. And they obviously get on a plane and go out to New Zealand once a year, and they go and agree a contract, they buy forward, and that's just taking that seasonality of price away from us, and we just don't lamb very early anymore. So where are the sheep in the UK? Mainly they are concentrated in the areas which are hills and uplands. So they're mainly in that dark bit in Wales, the bit that sticks out. Wales has got a high concentration of sheep, and again in the north of England particularly, and where Elaine came from down in the southwest of England, there's quite a concentration as well. But they tend to be the less favoured areas, as we call them, the harder areas to farm. And historically, those are also the areas which are supported to the highest degree. So they get more money simply because they are difficult areas to farm. And the thing about that is that the UK industry, and the way that you will see it set up and the way you will see individual flocks, is very much resource driven. So whereas if I was a pig farmer, you would set up a pig unit and you would bring all the feed in and you would have a blueprinted pig unit and that would be it. With a sheep flock, you have a farm and you audit your resources, and you actually, the most profitable farms will be the ones that actually work to those resources. So it means that we have a vast array of type of sheep, breed of sheep. I've lost count. The potential output in terms of quality and quantity is hugely different. So there's no, we have benchmarks, but they have to be benchmarks that are meaningful to the person. A hill flock would be aiming to sell 1 lamb per ewe per year, whereas my big lowland producers, we will be hoping to do 1.8 or more on a spring lambing flock. Vast differences in terms of output. Lambing dates. There's no point in being in the hills and uplands and lambing too early. It will also affect things like finishing capacity. So we'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of stratification. But if you haven't got the finishing capacity, you have to move them on. And I think that's something which is common to a lot of you guys as well, is that you will be moving lambs on into feeding lots or big feed lots to finish them. Profitability, hugely variable, and the reliance on other income. So one of the things that I, as a consultant, when I go onto a farm, have to take into consideration pretty quickly is to find out how much that sheep system on that farm is reliant on money for other places. So it might be that they're running their sheep on what we would call an environmentally sensitive area, and they're getting paid so much per acre, so much per hectare to graze that area. And woe betide me if I go in there and say, we can make more money out of these sheep by doing this system, and they lose all that money. So it's a bit of a nightmare, and it's that is actually a big break on our ability to improve our efficiency and our output. So the other thing I think to be aware of, just from the UK point of view, is that we're the only country in the world that's got a stratified sheep system. And by that, what we mean is that historically, our hills and uplands have integrated with the lowlands to provide the lowlands with breeding sheep. And that has allowed a flow of money from these less favoured areas. It means a lot of sheep move around. So it means that when foot and mouth hit us in 2001, it hit us like a brick through a window. It was horrific. But it does also mean that money from the lowland, and that lowland area there that's ringed, is where we would produce most of our finished lamb from. Okay, so the hills and uplands are providing some breeding sheep. The wether lambs, the castrated males, of course, will be a source for meat, but they're not desperately efficient. Really, it's all about most of that efficient lamb production coming from the lowlands. And so that's where I come from in the UK. I'm a Cumbrian by birth, so that's my home. And in those areas, extremely difficult. Probably on that particular fell, you're probably running a 1 herdwick, the Beatrix Potter sheep, to 3 or 4 acres, something like that. It just is almost recreational. And then in the lower bit where the sun's shining, the better fields where they would do the lambing or whatever. So, but those are the really hard hill areas. And this was be a Scottish situation. There's a Scottish blackface, a traditional Scotch blackface. Again, self-replacing. In this situation here, we have what we call hefting. So that's the western lakes. Anybody been to Cumbria, to the Lake District? Yeah, lots of people. Okay, so the central lakelands, it's all one big field. There ain't a fence anywhere. And so one of the things they would call hefting, the sheep know where they live. And that was developed over many generations by the shepherds going up there and staying with them and making the sheep stay where they should be. And now they do it on their own. And in foot and mouth disease, a friend of mine and I spent many an evening 1 week persuading the powers that be, rather than bring all of those lambing sheep down off the hills in the foot and mouth outbreak, to let them ride. We lost quite a lot, but to leave them there, because if we'd lost all of those sheep from there, the Lake District would have been completely kaput. Took a few cases of red wine, and we'd ring each other up at 1 o'clock in the morning and say, have you got anywhere? And blood on the carpet in London with the politicians. But we won. And it was because of that, because we knew if we took them off, we'd never get them back. Okay, so Scotch Blackface, again, hardy ewe, perfectly capable of lambing quite a lot of lambs if you take her into a less hardy situation, but they're very hardy animals. Another bit of the Lake District, again, Herdwick's in the front there. And a little bit, those are the sorts of areas where their output is limited. So by having breeding stock, they're adding value, basically. So instead of getting maybe 40 or 45 pounds for a store lamb, they will be getting 95 to 100 pounds for the females as breeders. So it's big added value. And they'll use the old girls to do that. So they bring them down and they will draft them down and cross them with one of these guys that Elaine will recognise. Blue-faced Leicester, probably more like brown-faced Leicesters at home now. Extremely prolific, not usually that way up. They're usually legs in the air dead. Okay. In the old days, I used to use 35mm slides, and I would break, if I'd got a really difficult farmer group to talk to, I'd usually accidentally on purpose put the 35mm slide of the blue-faced Leicester in upside down. Oh dear, blue-faced Leicester in its normal position. But they are extremely prolific. And of course, what happens is when you cross them with one of these hill ewes is that we get this F1 hybrid, which is the mule. And the beauty of an F1 hybrid is that hybrid vigour affects traits that are not very heritable, and prolificacy and milking ability are not desperately heritable. But with hybrid vigour, you put two things together and the sum is better than the average of the two. And our hill producers worked out, well, probably back in the 70s this really took off, and it's been a really good source of income. So now, in terms of our lowland flocks, something like 45% of our breeding ewes still are either an F1, similar to this, or they're an F2, that they're half this and they've had a terminal sire over them. So it's still quite a big influence. But it's not, it's getting less. It is getting less. So in 1971, 86% of our breeding sheep would have an association with that stratified system. By 2003, it was down to 71%. And now the last estimate is that it's down to 55%. So it's creaking. It is creaking, and it's partly creaking because of the way subsidies are going, partly creaking because of biosecurity concerns, following foot and mouth. So we wonder how that's going to go, because the hills and uplands are the areas that are suffering. So we're losing sheep out of the hills and uplands. There's vast areas of Scotland, for example, where they're actually paying people, literally, they will buy the sheep for you and make you put them back on those areas, because they realise if they don't graze them, they're just going to revert back to scrub. And the great British public don't realise that if you don't graze these areas, all they are is impenetrable scrub. Okay, so it's quite an issue for us. You've got these graphs in there. I won't dwell on it because of time today, but we get accused in the UK sheep industry, and I guess you might get accused of it as well. Oh, you sheep people, you never change. You never adopt technology. Well, we do, and we do have quite a lot of change. It's just that it's not quite as easy as being a pig producer, where you can adopt things because you've got much greater control over your variables. We haven't got much control over that white stuff out there today, for example, have we? Okay. But just to point out to you that at the far right of that graph, there's a breed called a Clyn. I don't know whether anybody's come across the Clyn or the Cleen, originated in the Cleen Peninsula in Wales. And it's probably the best example that we've got of a dual-purpose breed. So they're quite prolific, they're good mothers, they can be bred pure, and they do a pretty good job. And back in, when these were done back in certainly up to 1996, it didn't even feature on there whereas now the clean is starting to get to be much more popular, and it's because more of our flocks are closing themselves and breeding their own replacements. Rightly or wrongly, some of them are doing it well. If you breed your own replacements and you do it badly, you're in trouble. And unfortunately, there are quite a few of them who are in that position. But they're mainly doing it from a disease point of view. Yeah. And so the mule's under a bit of pressure, but you can see from that graph there, the mule types in the middle, back in 1971, they were just beginning to be there. And then during the 70s, 80s and 90s, they really took over because this F1 animal really does perform. And you can buy them in and do the job and concentrate on just breeding them and producing lamb. And we've also seen quite a big change in ram breeds. Okay, so the Suffolk was always the stalwart of the UK sheep industry. The Suffolk's had a real good pasting in the last few years. It's responding, and it needed to, but the Continentals have really beaten it at its own game. So the Texel and the Charolais now would be on equal billing, if not higher, than the Suffolks. And that's simply because they will do what it says on the tin. Unfortunately, the Suffolk is still our fastest growing animal. From a carcass point of view, absolutely no problem. But unfortunately, a lot of our Suffolk breeders bred the vigour out of them. Big, daft, soft things that sit around when they're born and no vigour at all. You get a Texel or a Charolais lamb hit the ground, and what we say, they're wick, they're up and they're away and they're off with it. And so now the Suffolk breeders are looking at that, and it's really interesting actually, because they've done some lovely work with Cathy Dwyer in Edinburgh, looking at the heritability of that, and they've taken Suffolk sires and used them across a set number of flocks with AI, and looked at the vigour across a number of flocks, and it's quite clear that some Suffolk sires were a lot more vigorous, their lambs were a lot more vigorous, and the heritability of that is very high as well. So they've been able to correct it quite quickly, which is quite interesting. Again, from the point of view, I know Robin and I talked about lamb survival and so on. We'll talk a bit more about that if we get a chance later, but quite interesting. Okay, our carcass weights, nowhere near as big as yours. We've got bigger, and we'll talk about that perhaps a little bit more, but we're averaging probably about 19, just over 19 kilos carcass weight now, with quite a bit of variation around that. One of the reasons, and again it's one of the challenges that we have, and I'll throw it out there now so perhaps you can discuss it in a minute in terms of what your challenges are. Our trade will not take carcasses over about 21, 22 kilos tops. And yet genetically, we've got animals that are perfectly capable of doing 30. Okay? A massive, massive glass ceiling for our industry. And so I'm just thinking, I'm throwing that out there, that might be one thing that you guys want to discuss. We've got 4 basic systems. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if you want to, and I do this for the students because I've got to actually talk to degree students who don't know absolutely nothing about sheep and try and get some sort of structure into it. And I just find it quite useful. So our producers don't all drop into this, but you perhaps get breeding flocks where they're producing store animals. So similarly as you would do if you were selling weaned lambs into a feedlot or whatever, they haven't got the resources to finish them, they breed them, they sell them on. Then we would get a lot of guys, and a lot of the ones I work with, where we breed them and finish them on the same farm, so it's all done in the same place. Last week I was on one of my biggest producers, and he will sell about breed and sell about 7,500 lambs a year. Okay. We've then got store lamb finishers, so they would be the equivalent perhaps of your feedlots, but again we'll throw in a few things later on. They'll be finished on from anything at all. We tend not to have feedlots at all. And then we'd have breeding and breeding stock producers. So we'd have the pedigree guys breeding the rams, and we'd have our hill guys breeding stock. But some people might be all 4. Certainly a lot of people are 2, but it just gives you a little bit of a feel for it. So these guys here, this is a mule flock, doesn't have the resource. I mean, it's a little bit of a cheat because they're waiting for their breakfast, so they're all a bit together, but pretty poor quality grazing, and he would be selling his lambs on for someone else to finish. And so we, again, have got quite a big livestock market system. Still about 70% of our lambs are actually sold through these markets to go for killing. Don't go direct to the plants. We maybe got to 35% now direct to plants. But all that breeding stock goes through, a lot of it goes through a live market, and a lot of the store stock does. And that has its advantages, but its big disadvantage is disease and traceability. Yeah, and again, I know that's something which is high on your list of agenda items. So store lamb finishing, as I say, we'll have lots of things. You might be on grass, and we'll give them a bit of concentrate on grass, or we'll have forage crops. The one on the right there, stubble turnips, will be something that's sown, either undersown under a cereal, or it's drilled in as soon as the cereal's taken off. A catch crop, 100-day turnips, have quite a lot of that within arable rotations. Or we'd have something like this, which is actually a summer-sown forage crop. So there we would be weaning lambs onto that in about the second week of July. And those lambs will have been born in March, and they'll have been weaned onto that. So all sorts of things. Again, just throwing out some ideas as well as to what you can do, or maybe in terms of forage. And that's one of my clients. So just to prove, on the right-hand side, the pens on the right are all finishing lambs. The pens on the left are ewes. You'll see this shed again with its TMR and so on for the ewes. But I guess that's as near as we get to the feedlot type system. They're on a TMR, those lambs, so they're on a silage-based diet, forage, virtually no concentrate at all, and they will be rocking on at 300, 350 grams a day on that diet. So efficiency-wise, very efficient. But that is unusual in the UK. Okay, that is unusual. But just to sort of show that we do have those sorts of systems. We do use quite a lot of housing. Not everybody. We don't have the weather that you have. We had -12 just before Christmas, so we can get a little bit of weather, but I was saying to Elaine, the wheels come off, everything just grinds to a halt in the UK. You guys just keep going, it's amazing, it's brilliant. But we just, pathetic. So a lot of housing, to do with winter carrying capacity, obviously, but that adds to our costs. Quite a bit of people will, and we'll talk about this again later when I talk about lamb performance, will use creep feed for lambs to substitute in for poorer quality grazing. But equally, and this is my 4,500 ewe flock that I was on last week that sells all of those lambs, he doesn't house. He's probably one of my most profitable flocks. The guy in the foreground is the manager, and he's one of the best livestock managers. You know, it's like, you know, some people are good and some people are very good, and this guy's very good. So that what they're eating there, they're heavily pregnant ewes, those. They'll be in groups of 500, and they will only actually come into the yards to actually lamb. So they're sugar beet tops. So that's the top after the sugar beet has been harvested, and that's a very traditional system where I currently live in Eastern England, where we would utilise arable byproducts, cheap feed, but we also need to feed them. So anybody who can see really carefully there, you can see some little black bits flying through the air. That's breakfast. Okay, so historically they used to feed these ewes in the run-up to lambing. We have to give them some supplement. They would feed them a home mix in troughs. The shepherds were really fit, okay? The dogs were really good, because you'd have to go in, dog the ewes back, get out the Land Rover, run like hell before you actually got mobbed by 500 ewes. You can imagine 580 kilo ewes is just a bit of a challenge, okay? And then what happened was, and just to sort of show you how some of these things come about, a disease issue hit us. This flock actually is between a reservoir and a massive waste tip. And the seagulls were thinking, and they were coming down, and where there were bits of food lying around, and they were doing what they do. When they dropped them, they came down to pick up, and we lost 600 ewes aborted with salmonella and campylobacter one year. And the vets all said, well, that's it, you'll have to house them. And we said, I don't think so. I think that might make this flock totally unproductive. So we had to come up with something else. So we came up with, what's on the back of the tractor is a sow feeder. It's a 1.5 ton sow feeder with a great big spinning disc. It comes down out the hopper onto a big spinning disc, and it'll shoot it about 100 feet that way if you want it to. And the vet said, you can't do that. You can't have a sheep eating off the mud. Why not? So we did, and basically that's what's happening there. So now it's no stress on the shepherds are a bit fatter, but no stress on the sheep, less stress on the shepherds, and it really does work very well. But you know, necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it? And it was a disease issue that made us do that. And I now use those machines in the big sheds I showed you, not the one with the finishing lambs, and just the view of the 2 sheds. There's 1,000 ewes in each of those sheds, and we use one of those machines in the shed as well, so it just pops the nuts onto the floor, and the ewes spend all day quite happily eating their food. No mess, no nothing, no wastage. Absolutely fantastic. So, just to finish this little bit, UK challenges. For us, it's Brexit and exports at the moment, and the fact that profitability ain't great. We'll talk about that later. But we are worried. The sheep industry, we're at the bottom of the heap. Okay, so as far as agriculture and the UK and Europe is concerned, we know we are the most vulnerable sector. So it's very important to us. We need to wean ourselves off subsidy. Our government is saying that it will still support farming, but by Jove, it's going to look different to what it has in the past. What we're going to have to jump through to get it, I don't know. I'm hoping it will be constructive. I'm hoping that it will be associated with efficiency and uptake of technology and really push on with some of the stuff that we've got. Costs and efficiency, yep, we can be a lot more efficient. I'm not going to pretend to you and come here and say, oh, the UK sheep industry is really, really efficient. No, we're not. Our top guys are. Our top guys, the top 10%, are rocking and rolling. The guys who are using EID, and I'll allude to some of that as we go through, but we still are not an efficient industry by a long chalk. Carcass assessment and so on, we'll come back to that because I think that's a little bit close to what you guys want to do. And we have a very poor understanding of where people are and what KPIs are and how we can use them, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about that today as well. If I go into a room like this, and I do quite often, of UK sheep producers, and I say to them, right, pretend I'm a buyer from one of these big supermarkets, Sainsbury's or Walmart or whatever it is. And I've walked in here, and we do have 1 or 2 people. I've got people now on contract, so we have a cost plus contract, pence per kilo, 4 lambs. Go into a room like this and say, right, okay, how much money do you guys need for you to make money and for me to be able to sell it? What price are we going to have? And 95% of our producers will look at you and go, you what? I haven't got a clue. I haven't got a clue. So I don't know whether you guys are any better. I'm looking around the room, but maybe you can tell me you're a lot better than that. But they don't know. Whereas when guys do know what their cost of production is, you can have that conversation. And it takes out a lot of the volatility. So one of the other issues we have is vast volatility in terms of price. Everyone's a price taker, no one's a price maker. And our market system makes us weak in that context. So we've got to tackle that one. Just finally, and this again will resonate with you as well, I think, is we have an issue with sheep meat, do we not, in terms of its competitiveness with other sources of protein and meat particularly, yeah? And I was asking the guys there earlier on, you know, is lamb seen in Canada as it's seen in the UK, which is a high quality, high cost, special treat meat, which we want it to be because it costs us a fortune to grow it. And you're agreeing, yeah? It is? Okay. And it needs to be, because it's never going to be cheap to produce. That's it. You know, and it has a problem with competitiveness because it's a small package. And this is where our small carcasses come in, because you've got an awful lot of work, unlike other food. So if you do a loaf of bread or a muffin or whatever, you take the ingredients into the factory, you assemble them into a product, you then brand it or whatever else you want to do to add value, and then you sell it out to your customer. What do we do with meat? We take in a bundle of product and then we have to disassemble it into something that we can sell. All the different cuts, don't we? So, you know, a leg's easy to sell, but some of the other bits aren't easy to sell, are they? I mean, I don't know. You might say that you can, sometimes shoulders are easier to sell in the UK, but it isn't as straightforward as saying we've got X amount of meat, is it? So our competitiveness is something, and I noticed, I just had a quick zip round and I picked 1 or 2 bits up in the room next door, and you're talking about carcass. I think it was in the beef context as well, about heavier carcasses and the opportunities. And this is where we're looking to. So it's really interesting to see you guys with your heavier carcasses. So I think that's my bit of an introduction anyway. I'll leave you with another photo home because I don't see it often enough, and it's really quite nice to see it. But seriously, again, from a UK point of view, because we have so much of our production linked to these areas, one of the things that's going to be a big challenge for us now in the next 5 to 10 years is how we keep farming those areas. Literally how we keep farming those areas, because it's never going to be profitable. Okay, so tourism's really massively important to us, but you're not going to get tourism if they have to fight through a thorn thicket to get there. So it is a serious challenge to us to be able to do that.